I feel like it's calm before the storm. The whole country is waiting for Iran and its proxies to attack Israel. They have said so, that they'll do so every single day now.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines.
I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
In this episode of Battle Lines, we look at how Israel is preparing for a possible war with Iran and a deep dive into how Hamas fights. We also pop over to Paris and see how the French have been covering the riots and what advice they would give the UK, plus an explainer of what's been happening in Bangladesh. It's Friday, August 9th, 2024. We begin in Israel, where the country has been on tenterhooks following the double assassination of a top Hezbollah leader in Lebanon and Hamas's political chief Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. Israel hasn't officially claimed responsibility, but is widely believed to be behind the killings. Now the world is waiting to see how Iran and its proxy Hezbollah will respond. I caught up with our reporter Jotam Confino to find out more. Thanks so much for joining us on Battle Lines, Jotam. Maybe you could start by telling us, what's the mood in Israel right now?
I feel like it's calm before the storm. The entire country has been on the edge since Wednesday last week, when Israel allegedly, we have to say allegedly because Israel has not taken responsibility for the killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran yet, but the whole country is waiting for Iran and its proxies to attack Israel. They have said so, that they'll do so every single day now. And Israel has been on high alert across the whole country because both Iran and especially Hezbollah have the capacity to hit every corner of Israel. So this is causing a lot of distress, especially in the government, because they're under a lot of pressure in general from the public to do something about these constant threats, especially from Hezbollah in Lebanon. And even though most of the country, it seems like everyone's on the edge, the IDF, the Israeli military, has consistently said that there's no change to any guidelines in people's everyday lives. In other words, they can continue with their lives until they hear something official from the military about a potential attack.
And that's sort of what we had in the last round of exchange, didn't we? The Israeli military didn't really change their advice until quite shortly before, and they clearly then knew that something was coming. What has the IDF been doing to prepare?
So my understanding is that, first of all, Israel has shut down a number of factories, especially in the northern part of Israel, because they fear that Hezbollah might be able to target them with some of their precision-guided missiles. They have also made sure that all hospitals in Israel have opened extra wards in anticipation of mass casualties. And in addition to that, we hear that the home front command, such as the medical services, medical staff, have now gathered outside of Tel Aviv, also preparing for eventual mass casualties in Tel Aviv. And most of Israel's air force is on high alert to retaliate immediately. That's actually something that the defense minister said the other day. He said Israel's army, and especially the air force, should be prepared to react immediately to any attack coming from Iran or from Hezbollah.
What kind of scenarios are expected? You've done a piece for us outlining the various ways that Iran could attack Israel and what could happen next. What kind of things are we talking about here?
So if we start with the most aggressive and severe attack, it could be Iran launching ballistic missiles at Israel, along with its proxies who also have ballistic missiles, such as the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And of course, Hezbollah, which has precision-guided missiles that can target anywhere in Israel. If those three actors combined launch a great volley of missiles, more than they did in April, it could overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome and its air defense system.
It's quite a big could, isn't it? Because Israel does have an amazing air defense system, and we expect Britain would also come in and help as well, and the Americans.
True, but we have to remember that Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles. 4,500 of those can reach Tel Aviv. At least 1,000 of them are precision-guided, which means that they will hit the target. And I think it's naive, and I think most experts also believe that it's naive to think that Israel could manage to shoot down 99% of all of those missiles. like they did back in April. In April, it was around 360 missiles and drones. And again, if Iran and Hezbollah really goes against Israel in an aggressive manner, it would be many more missiles. So that's the most severe consequence. Then you have Iran refraining from attacking Israel directly, but allowing its proxies to do some of its work, not targeting civilian areas, but targeting military bases. That's still an escalation, but something that Israel could contain and something that Israel could justify its own response it could justify it being less aggressive than, for example, if it hits civilian areas. So that's the second option. Then there are other options that Iran has if it wants to hit Israel, and that is mainly targeting Israeli citizens and embassies abroad. Now, this is a much more, I wouldn't call it serious, but an easier option for Iran, because the embassies are pretty heavy with security. But after all, it's not a country. They don't have air defense systems at their availability. So to hit an embassy, we've already seen this in Sweden, for example. They managed to throw some sort of a device into the Israeli embassy in Sweden. It's easier, and it could cause a serious diplomatic incident if, let's say, a diplomat was killed or even wounded.
And you mentioned the Israeli Air Force being told to react immediately. Is that what we would expect to happen next if there was some kind of actual attack on Israeli territory?
I believe so. Again, there's a huge distinction between targeting civilian areas, if Hezbollah targets Tel Aviv, let's say, or if they target military bases. I think either way, the Israeli Air Force would probably retaliate pretty fast. They already have plans drawn up for which kind of response they could come with. So let's say that both Iran and Hezbollah target Tel Aviv. They send ballistic missiles over, and we have mass casualties. We should expect an immediate response from Israel, both in Lebanon, but also in Iran. And it would be very severe. It would target their infrastructure, and it could also, of course, cause mass civilian casualties. If they just target military bases, it would also be a response, but I don't think it would necessarily be immediately. And I think they would also be they would think twice about which areas to hit inside Lebanon, because the last thing they want is to drag the entire country of Lebanon into a war now.
And is there appetite amongst the Israeli public for this to grow into a bigger confrontation? Obviously, the war in Gaza has been dragging on, knocking on a year now. The toll on the Israeli military is growing. Some hostages are still there. I know there are still protests in the public. West Bank situation is deteriorating. What's the Israeli public mood on a wider confrontation with Lebanon or Iran?
I would say I would have to answer this in two ways. First of all, most Israelis consistently, according to most recent polls, would prefer to have a ceasefire with Hamas that would solve the war in Gaza and free all the hostages. And by extension, that would solve the issue with Hezbollah in the north, because Hezbollah has made it clear from the beginning that it will only stop attacking Israel the minute there's a ceasefire in Gaza. So you could say that most Israelis would prefer this solution. But if you talk about Hezbollah specifically and the fact that 60,000 Israelis have been internally displaced along the border with Lebanon, many of those have for months called on the government to actually go to war with Hezbollah, because they don't see this as a viable solution to have 10 months of daily attacks that kill people and leave them homeless. And they see it as there's no other option. This is the only way to deal with Hezbollah, is to go to war with them. There are other, obviously, more concerned citizens in Israel that know exactly what kind of damage and chaos a war with Hezbollah would bring, who really don't want to see this scenario. Also experts, security experts who have very deep knowledge about these issues, that know exactly how many civilians would be killed in this. They prefer to solve all of this in a diplomatic way.
I want to talk about your excellent piece about how Hamas fights in a second. But first, I just want to ask you about another story that you've written for us this week. And that's about this report that came out about widespread abuse in Israeli detention centres, including the now notorious Sde Timan facility in the Negev desert. I'm just going to quickly quote from the report, and then I'd be interested to hear what the response has been like in Israel. It was written by B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organisation based in Jerusalem. And they've collected testimonies that, quote, clearly indicate a systemic institutional policy policy focused on the continual abuse and torture of all Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. They cite severe arbitrary violence, sexual assault, humiliation, degradation, deliberate starvation, sleep deprivation. What's been the response in Israel to all of this?
If we start with the authorities, they are, of course, dismissing these allegations. Both the prison service and the IDF said that they are sticking with law and order. They would never do such things, and any violation of those guidelines will be investigated. Now, we know that's not true because there have been incidents in the past, especially about torture of Palestinian prisoners. So I think that few people believe that explanation. Israelis in general also a bit torn about this because there are the most hardline people in Israel do not care one bit about the Palestinian prisoners, in particular those who committed massacres on October the 7th. They don't care at all. Some of them say, do whatever you want with them. Really, we simply don't care. The more, I would say, moderate Israelis, of course, are furious about this because not only should Israel obey laws, but it also puts immense pressure on Israel in the international system. The last thing they need is another horrific story coming out of Israel with how Palestinian prisoners have been treated. Now, I spoke to B'Tselem because I was interested in hearing what offenses, what charges some of these people that they interview, what kind of offenses and charges there are against them. And they said that they didn't ask them about this, which I find a bit interesting because I think there is a difference between a 15-year-old boy who threw a stone, who was in administrative detention and who's being tortured, and a Hamas terrorist who committed massacres on October 7th. It goes without saying that neither of them should be tortured. But I do believe that it is important to make a distinction between hardcore terrorists and seemingly innocent young people who maybe have thrown a stone or whatever kind of offense they might have caused.
So let's talk about Hamas. You've done a big investigation for us in the Telegraph, which our listeners can read via a link in the show notes, about how they fight. What kind of things did you find out?
I think the most interesting thing is that Hamas does not hide how they're operating at all. In fact, they're trying to show the whole world exactly what it is that they're doing because those who support Hamas will see this as them being brave, as them hitting the worst enemy in the world. So what I found is that most of the videos contain some sort of scene with a Hamas fighter in civilian clothes firing an RPG at a tank. It is a consistent scenario throughout most of the videos that I see. And I asked one of the experts, why is that? What is this obsession with the tanks? And he said it's because the tanks symbolize Israeli military strength. And they associate tanks with how Israel defeated the Arab armies in 1967 and 1973. I think that's quite interesting. It's a trophy for them. I also found that their surveillance is extremely good, both offensive and defensive. Offensive surveillance means that they knew exactly where to target Israel on October 7th. They collected satellite images. They had drones all over the border with Israel to know exactly where to hit the Israeli military installations. They proved immensely successful in their offensive surveillance methods. In terms of defense, they had spotters, they have surveillance cameras, and also Gaza is an open terrain, so it's very easy to spot where the Israeli tanks are moving back and forth. And lastly, I found that they have made use of explosive devices and booby traps all across Gaza, which have actually caused quite a lot of casualties on the Israeli side. And it's partially why we see such destruction in Gaza. Obviously, the Israeli airstrikes have done most of the damage, but a lot of the damage is also caused by Hamas planting booby traps and explosive devices. And lastly, they also make use of snipers, and they snipe from sometimes 200 meters away, which is not really normally considered sniping distance, but here it is. And they fight from every civilian infrastructure you can think of, from apartments, bedrooms, hospitals, mosques, and schools. And this is why John Spencer, one of the best warfare experts in the world, said that there's been no other urban warfare like this in history. Stalingrad, Mosul, nothing compares to what's happening in Gaza right now.
I want to come on to that point in a bit more depth in a second, but you mentioned that all of this is out in the open. Can you tell us a bit about how you researched this piece?
Yeah. So first of all, I relied heavily on Hamas's own material because we've been, as journalists, have been bombarded, and we still are being bombarded with videos from the IDF on a daily basis where we see how they maneuver in Gaza. So that's all out in the open, and there are endless videos of that. So we already have a pretty good understanding of how the Israelis fight and how they maneuver around Gaza. What was interesting for me was to scour through all of the Al-Qassam videos, which are, first of all, very well put together. It's really high quality. You would be surprised how good it looks, first of all, and also the propaganda value of it. They come off as extremely brave and heroic, and they target, obviously, soldiers and not civilians inside Gaza. But I simply went through all of their videos, but also looked through some of their statements and to back up some of the claims that Israel makes, of course, about the Al-Shifa hospital, which is one of the biggest stories of Gaza. Hamas said that Israel was committing massacres inside Al-Shifa hospital and they were not present there. And that's simply not true, because I have found statements from Hamas saying we're currently fighting against the Israeli forces in the Al-Shifa area. And these fights went on for days. Now, if no Hamas fighters were near or in the hospital, there wouldn't be 2 weeks of fighting. So I relied actually on their own information, and it's a very, very good tool to understand how they operate and also to understand why Israel has had such difficulties destroying Hamas's military capability, simply because they've turned the entire Gaza Strip into a battlefield.
So how has Israel adapted to this? Israel has spoken for a long time about Hamas using civilians as human shields and fighting within a civilian environment. Some would say they don't really have a choice. It's not like Hamas can have like a military base out in the open like Israel, because it would be bombed immediately. But how has Israel adapted to this now that they've been going through this war in Gaza for 9-10 months?
So in the beginning, they suffered a lot of casualties from the ambushes. It's another strategy of Hamas. They lure Israeli tanks and soldiers into specific areas that they want them to, and then they kill them or attack them. And that's something that I think Israel tried to adjust to in the beginning, but it was very difficult simply because Hamas's military capability was intact, obviously. Since then, they have made use of airstrikes, and they did that from the beginning, actually. They usually conduct a lot of airstrikes on apartment buildings or buildings in general where they believe that Hamas are hiding, and they try to do as much damage as possible before they send in the tanks and the soldiers, and it's simply to spare Israeli casualties. Also means that more civilians in Gaza will die. And that's something that we have to remember, because when we talk about civilian casualties in Gaza, first of all, we don't know the exact number of civilian casualties because Hamas doesn't publish or distinguish between terrorists or civilians when they publish their death toll. But when we look at how many, and we know obviously that thousands of civilians have been killed, mostly women and children. When we look at the reason why, there are two factors. Firstly, and most importantly, because Hamas is hiding in the areas where they are, including humanitarian areas. But you also have to look at Israel's willingness to cause collateral damage, as you call it in war terms. If Israel sees a Hamas terrorist who's a high target, they wouldn't blink. They wouldn't think twice with taking out this target if it means that 20 other civilians will be killed. Now, this is a legitimate criticism of Israel's warfare. Completely legitimate. You could easily say that you cannot justify killing 20 people to take out one terrorist. I think that's where a lot of discussions go wrong, because they put the entire blame on Israel or for all blame on Hamas. And it's somewhere in between. I think, again, Hamas is responsible for this completely. But if Israel wanted to lower the civilian casualties, they could by conducting less airstrikes. And they have simply said, we can't afford to allow them to be in Gaza and to attack us. It's their responsibility, and therefore we take them out.
Just in the last week, we've seen several strikes on schools and on a displacement camp, dozens killed. Hamas-controlled health authority in Gaza says mostly women and children. And the IDF nearly always says that there was a Hamas target. For example, the 2 schools that were struck this week, they were apparently command and control centres for Hamas's Al-Farkan battalion. But it really does call into question this sort of balancing. And you mentioned the numbers. I just want to give our listeners the latest numbers that we have. According to the Hamas-controlled health authority, around 40,000 dead, and that's seen to be largely accurate by international authorities, although obviously it's incredibly difficult. No one can go in to check any of these numbers. And the latest number that we have from Israel in terms of how many of those are Hamas militants is around 14,000.
Yeah, so the number 14,000 is from mid-May, from Netanyahu. And this is only Hamas. And a lot of people probably don't know how many groups actually operate inside Gaza. Of course, Hamas is by far the largest group in there with around 30,000 fighters, but Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, the Mujahideen Brigade, and the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade are also operating in there. So we should expect at least several thousand casualties in addition to the 14,000, if we believe the Israeli estimate. And if we believe the Hamas estimate, we should probably also believe the Israeli estimate. So let's say roughly 18, maybe 1,000 terrorists have been killed and 14,000 in total. That means that a little over the majority of those killed are civilians. And again, for anyone listening to this, it might sound brutal because the number is so large. But if you look at other wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's a completely different number. And it sounds very cynical, and it's very difficult to sit here and say that 20,000 people is just the price you pay for war. That's not the point. The point is that warfare, and especially when you're not having two sovereign nations fighting each other, but you're fighting against guerrilla warfare or terrorism, civilian casualties will always be high. And in other places, the ratio is much higher. That it doesn't mean that it's okay. It just we have to put things into perspective because people often forget how many civilians were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jotam Confino in Israel.
My pleasure.
Now to Paris, where the Olympics have given the country a brief respite from the political turmoil of the last few months. I spoke to our France correspondent, Henry Samuel, about how the French have viewed the unrest in the UK and what lessons we could learn from how they handle their riots. Welcome to Battle Lines, Henry. Let's start by talking about how the French press have been covering the unrest in the UK. What kind of things have the newspapers been saying?
Well, obviously wall-to-wall Olympics over here, so it's very difficult to talk about anything else. But yes, they have noticed that there have been riots in the UK, and there's been some surprise over that because France is the land of protests and riots. The difference being that France is usually the hard left that seems to be the ones causing the problems, and here, they've noticed that it's more the far right. But yeah, when you look at the press, for example, Figaro talked about there being a whiff of civil war in the air, and it's also been using the word insurrection, which is a very French word, sort of revolutionary term. And it's a term that we heard in France, for example, during the Yellow Vest revolt of 2018 over here, which got extremely violent, if you remember. So that's the press, but the press has been picking up also on the fact that this has been whipped up a lot by social media, by mentioning people like Elon Musk, who says civil war is inevitable, and perhaps other foreign parties trying to amplify the problems. And then and politically, the hard right over here, Marine Le Pen's National Rally, some members, there's an MEP, for example, claiming that this is really the UK's failure to get a handle on immigration has led to this state of affairs, and all the more reason for France and Europe to beef up its borders, etc. So they've been kind of going in on it, whereas the left has been saying quite the contrary, that the riots have unmasked the true and ugly face of the far right, and that we should do everything we can to keep them out of power. Because if you may or may not remember that we had snap elections here in France last month, and the National Rally got a lot of votes.
I want to drill into something that you said about the protests, or riots rather, in France, more normally being instigated by the left than the right. Why is that?
Yes, France is a long revolutionary country, but there's a long history of demonstrations that often end in violence, and usually that violence is almost always hard left elements, black blocs, anarchists, Antifa, who smash up shops and banks, and they have running battles with police. And that's something that we see very often. It's sort of weirdly there's a lot of leniency, I think, in both in the French press and in political circles about this violence. It's almost an extension of, one's right to protest. So, the fact that things get broken, well, it's an unnecessary part of an expression of social dissatisfaction. And then there have been other types of riots in France. I mean, last year there were riots across the country after a teenage French Algerian who was driving without a license was shot dead by police. And that was not far left. That was that was the banlieue. That was the suburbs who exploded after what was considered to be police brutality. So that's slightly different. It used to be in the 80s and 90s, there were demonstrations by far-right organizations, and, they were anti-Semitic, some of them, and they had a sort of nostalgia for Vichy, Second World War. And they do still exist. Every now and again, you see far-right people, dressed in black leather and waving flags in Lyon, which has a small but very far-right element to it. And also in Paris, for example, early this year, there was a march. About 500 neo-Nazis paraded in the heart of Paris. And the police, there was a lot of outrage over that, but it wasn't stopped because it was considered to be, they didn't actually cause any public order issues, so it was allowed to go ahead. But essentially, you don't get far-right demonstrations as such in France, but I mean, you certainly get a lot of demonstrations, and it depends how you want to see them. When you look at the Yellow Vest protests of 2018, that this was essentially working class white France, you could almost call them sort of working class white France, feeling that they were being shortchanged, they couldn't make ends meet anymore, petrol prices has gone up, and they revolted. But I wouldn't call it far right. Lots of them ended up saying that they supported Marine Le Pen's National Rally, but there wasn't really an immigrant side to it. It was more just a sense, of social injustice and not being allowed to make ends meet. Look at there are polls, immigration along with security, were two very, very priority issues for the French. And it's not an accident that the National Rally of Marine Le Pen has been rising steadily over the last few years. In 2017, 1.5 million people voted for Marine Le Pen's party. Last month, she got more than 10 million votes. That's more than a third, quite a lot more than a third of the electorate. And one of the main issues is that France does not have a handle on immigration. So I think it would be wrong to suggest that it's an issue that isn't important here, but perhaps it's being addressed more within the political system now in France. And part of that is because the UK has a first past the post system, which means that you don't get voices of dissent, you get usually massive majorities. Here, that's no longer the case. And in fact, what we're seeing is we've got three blocks of power in Parliament. We've got the hard right, Marine Le Pen, we've got the centre, and we've got the left. It's a hung Parliament. It's a bit of a mess. But at least people feel they're being represented. Whereas perhaps in the UK, that doesn't happen as much. And that may be one of the reasons why you get it reaching a boiling point as it has done. People have been talking about football hooliganism and, the fact that the English Defence League is closely related to football hooliganism, and we don't get that in France. There isn't really football hooliganism, so there's not this kind of history of far right related hooligans wanting to go out and beat people up.
Finally, I just wanted to ask you about the policing aspect of it. There's been a lot of talk here about two-tier policing, about some protests organised by the left or certain other values, or police more softly, whereas the police have been quite harsh on the rioters recently. How do French police deal with riots, and are there any lessons that should be learned for the UK?
The French deal with riots in a very different way. They have done since the Second World War. A dedicated paramilitary police, called the CRS. This is an anti-riot police. They look like RoboCop. They wear body armor, they've got stun grenades and truncheons, and any demonstration in France, you go to Place de la République and it could be some rather tame demonstration, you will find rows and rows of vans full of riot police waiting in case there's action. And when they go and spray tear gas everywhere, water cannons, start knocking people on the head quite a lot. So there's a kind of dedicated anti-riot police that. And in the UK, it's far more Well, that does not exist. It's policing by consent. You get policemen wearing baseball caps rather than hard hats. So it's not at all the same culture. But where perhaps the French are in a way softer is in terms of sentencing. Don't get these very harsh and rapid sentencing of rioters in France, perhaps due to what I said earlier, which is there's some kind of tolerance in a way of this kind of violence. They crack down in terms of the police, but the sentencing isn't as harsh. Whereas we've seen in the UK, there's some very harsh sentences for rioters straight away. And I think that has been an important measure that seems to be, dissuading more people to go out and cause trouble in the UK. And that doesn't exist in France. And that may be one of the reasons why we get these very long protest movements. I mean, the Gilets jaunes, week after week, they were out there breaking things, smashing things. And, not that many people were really getting harsh sentences. So those are the differences that I see.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Henry Samuel, our France correspondent in Paris. Finally to Bangladesh, where this week has seen a political dynasty end after months of massive protests. Sarah Newey is our Asia correspondent. Let's start on Monday, when Sheikh Hasina fled by helicopter to India. She'd been in charge for 20 years. What happened?
Well, I think to understand what happened on Monday, we have to go back a couple of months to June, when student protests first started. There's a quota system in Bangladesh for government jobs. Been suspended since 2018, but the court put it back in place, which meant that about more than half of government jobs had to go to certain groups of people. And one of these groups of people were the children and grandchildren of those who fought in the independence war against Pakistan. This was seen as unfair to a lot of university graduates, and youth unemployment is really high in Bangladesh. And it was also seen as positive for Sheikh Hasina's followers. So it launched a whole load of peaceful protests. But the response was quite heavy-handed from Ms. Hasina's government. She called the protest razakars, which is a derogatory term for those who supported Pakistan during independence. She enforced an internet blackout, a curfew, sent police and paramilitary onto the streets with rubber bullets and pellets. And it really escalated. By about mid-July, estimates vary a little bit on deaths, but 100 or 200 people had died in these protests. It paused for a little bit, it calmed down, but then in early August, when the internet opened back up again, there was huge anger. And also by this point, the authorities had been going around and arresting thousands of people who'd been involved in these protests. Local newspapers estimate that up to 10,000 people had been arrested, including 2,800 in the last 2 weeks of July in the capital, Dhaka alone. Amnesty International called this a witch hunt. And I think that really unleashed anger against Ms. Hasina's government. It broadened out into not just calling for an apology from Hasina, but for her resignation. And it also tapped into anger about economic growth in the country, widening inequalities, the sense that it was an increasingly authoritarian government, so it was hard to protest about it in any other way, but the government was working for the few, not the many. And all this chaos erupted at the weekend when student leaders organised more protests, and Hasina and her party, the Awami League, kind of organised counter-protests, and there were clashes in the streets. The chaos just got worse and worse. The police couldn't control the situation, and it was one of the deadliest weekends in the protests so far. And that kind of all erupted into a boiling point where it was quite clear that Hasina couldn't stay in power. She held on right until the final moment. It was only an intervention from her son that pushed her to leave. And that really triggered remarkable scenes because she'd centralised power so much that the government kind of fell apart. But this amazing, remarkable footage shows exuberant looters kind of descending onto her home, onto Parliament. Her residence was completely looted, people taking selfies and souvenirs, people taking chickens and plants and plates and furniture, bashing portraits, at the same time tearing down statues of her father across the city, who was Bangladesh's actual founder. He led the fight for independence, but he was killed in 1975 in a coup. So all of this kind of erupted. It got to a point where there was really no alternative for Hasina. But it's a pretty remarkable fall from grace. There wasn't a peaceful transfer. She didn't have time to even speak over television to the country. And it's worth bearing in mind that this comes only after, in January, she swept to power in disputed elections, but this very clear looked like she was going to be entrenched for some time. So it's a pretty remarkable shift, and lots of analysts say it was a crisis of her own making. She used the same heavy-handed tactics that she's used to cling on to power, but this time it backfired.
Really the end of a political dynasty in Bangladesh. What comes next? Who's going to fill the power vacuum?
Well, there's still quite a lot of political uncertainty, but it has been announced that Muhammad Yunus is going to be the interim prime minister. He's just landed in the last half an hour back in Bangladesh. He was actually at the Olympics in Paris. He's a Nobel laureate and microfinance pioneer, and he was suggested by the students to lead an interim government. So he's going to be sworn in by the president tonight. He's an interesting character. He's largely steered clear of politics, bar a stint in 2007 where he launched a short-lived political party, basically all on an anti-corruption narrative. It didn't last very long, but by that point he'd really annoyed some powerful figures, including Hasina herself, who they had quite an open rivalry, and he's faced a lot of court cases and charges of corruption, which some human rights groups have said was politically motivated to keep him in his place. But yeah, so he's going to be leading this interim government. I think there are two immediate tasks: restoring order to the country and defining when there are going to be fresh elections, which is the next thing. But it's not clear. He was asked before he boarded a plane when that might be, and he said hold off, we'll work it out. So there's a lot of questions still swirling. There's a bit of a power vacuum. You've got different powerful parties, the opposition parties, the student groups. Hasina's supporters, her son is still saying that the family should have a role in politics, and the military. So it's going to be an interesting few weeks. Definitely the excitement in Bangladesh isn't over yet. It'll be interesting to see how it unfolds.
Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah Newey, our Asia correspondent in Bangkok. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.